Okay, so we are going to be re-entering this same sort of topic. We're going to talk about passages that can be personalized. It's very broad, or it's a very broad array of passages. I mean, basically, whatever the passage relies on the priorities of some entity, which is a person or animal or a group of people or whatever. Like, if there's a protagonist, and you can think as the protagonist in the situation, then pretty much you're going to understand what the priorities are. I mean, it's the same reason why stories are stories, and why stories are more interesting in general than things that are not stories, because you get it, because you get the priorities, and you get how these things impact the character and stuff like that. I mean, it's why when you tell a story, it has more meaning than just listing a bunch of observations. So, and I mean, just if you think about that, this is not a very GMAT-like example, obviously, but if you just think about the difference between saying something like, this glass object fell to the floor and broke, period, which is not a story, versus like, Josh dropped his mother's sculpture on the floor and it broke. I mean, those are technically the same, but think how many more layers of meaning there are in the second one. And like the reason why the second one means more to you is the same reason why the CR passages will instantly mean many more things if you can read them from an interested standpoint. Like, in other words, almost the worst thing you can do here is to read these objectively, which is sort of ironic if you come from, scientific method school of thought. But the worst thing you can do is not take sides and not get involved in these things. So you'll see. As far as some bookkeeping type stuff, when we say give me a smiley face, we're talking about the faces that are underneath your name here. This means, basically it means don't put stuff like this in the chat, because the chat will get crowded very quickly. We have between 30 and 40 people chatting. That's going to get crazy. So, but underneath your name, which fortunately for you is not Ron Perlwall, you will see this emotion icon thingamajig. So smiley face, that's what that is. And then for multiple choice questions, please use the choices that appear in the same sort of place. The choices are underneath your name. You'll see this letter A there. And then when you click that, you'll be able to pick A, B, C, D, E. Those things, when we put a question on the board with multiple choices, I will wait at least a little bit to try to give everyone time to answer it, because the point is that the GMAT makes you answer all the questions. So there's no such thing as not answering a question on the GMAT. So accordingly, we shouldn't not let you answer a question here. Shouldn't be a thing. Also, make sure you click once. If you click it twice, you will unanswer the question. So if you have an answer, click it just once. If you change your answer, click the new answer just once. And then nothing beyond that. Okay. Last but not least, copyright notice. All of the questions that follow are from the GMAT prep software, the free GMAT prep software, by the way, specifically, not just the GMAT prep. There's some confusion here, but we can't use questions from the paid software. We can't do it. So GMAT has asked us specifically not to use any of the paid materials. So that's primarily the OGs, but it also includes any of the paid patches or question marks that go with, question packs that go with the software. Can't use them. Okay, let's do one. Let's find a question for you to do. How about this? Remember where you find the answers to multiple choice questions. We find them there. There's no caption. There should be a caption. This is where you find the answers to multiple choice questions. All right, give it a shot. All right, we should try to pick a thing here pretty soon. It's about 30 people here, and fewer than half you guys picked an answer choice. So let's do it. Let's pick a thing. If you have to guess, then you should guess. Okay. There's still a bunch of people who haven't picked an answer. If you are named Carissa or Anna or Bharat or Ryan or she picked something. Okay. There are two mostly popular answers here, which are A and C, but there are at least some people picking every choice. So let's talk about personalizing it, because, all right, first of all, what you should do, there are two things that you have to do first with these questions. I mean, it sounds kind of weird, you know, two things I have to do first. That kind of sounds like one of them should be first and one of them should be second. But meaning you don't really have to do these in any particular order, but you do have to do them before you can really process this the way that you should. The first is to figure out the point of view from which to read, which that's something. But then the other thing you should also do is to figure out what the heck the task is. So, two things to do first with these things. I mean, one of these, in other words, is what you should do first with passages that you can personalize. So, in other words, adopt a point of view if that is possible. So, if that's something you can do. The point of today's passage is that that will be something that you can do in all of them, but in general, maybe not always. But then you gotta figure out what the heck you're supposed to do. Where do you figure out what you're supposed to do? Like, which part of this chunk of words? Like, where should you go first? So if the stem means this, then I'm never really sure when people use the fancy words like stem, because I think I've seen some people use stem to mean this, and I think other people use it to mean the passage. So, but the part that ends with a question mark, if that's what you mean, then that's what the point is. So, you know, this whole finding the conclusion thing, you know, maybe, but not necessarily, because that's less important in some instances than it is in others. So, but you want to read this first, because this is what, I mean, in other words, this should not really surprise you, but if you want to find out what you're supposed to do, then you should go look at the part where they ask you to do something. That's where you get that from. So here you're supposed to find an assumption. Now, without belaboring that particular point, there are entire study hall sessions where we go into more detail about assumptions, but the task here is find assumption, which can mean one of two things. I mean, directly, you could find it directly or you could find it indirectly. So there's two kinds of assumptions. Like, assumptions do two things if you find them directly. The first is if you notice a connection that has like a doubtful connection or dubious connection, then the speaker is just assuming that the connection is solid. like if I say you are wearing a suit, therefore you must be an honest person, okay, that would be a very dubious connection. Like I'm making an assumption that people who wear suits are not liars. That's probably a very bad assumption. Maybe a good point. The other kind of direct way to find assumptions is if you can think of a way to shoot down the reasoning. And the speaker is assuming whatever defeats that or dismisses that. So, if I say this normally takes an hour to get to this place, so if I leave now, I will get there in an hour. I mean, okay, I'm assuming lots of stuff. I'm assuming no traffic delays. I'm assuming no anything that will unexpectedly slow me down, that kind of thing. And then lastly, there's indirectly, which this tends to, for people who struggle with these kinds of questions at least, in my experience, this tends to be a little bit better because it's more concrete. Because remember that assumptions are necessary. So that's what the word assumption means. It means it's something that's necessary even though it hasn't been stated. So in other words, this means if it's false, then the argument falls apart. So what you can do is you can start from an answer choice. You can make that answer choice false, and the argument should be destroyed. And I mean, what's effective here, there's two things that are attractive about this kind of approach. The first is that if you notice, to find an assumption directly, you have to kind of just see stuff. Like you have to notice that there's a connection that's dubious, no one's going to point it out to you, or you have to think of some external way to shoot down a conclusion. Like if I say, I'm going to leave now, therefore I will get to this place in an hour, you need to just think about stuff like traffic because I haven't thought about it, and that's the whole point. So that's a disadvantage there, is that to directly find assumptions, you kind of have to come up with stuff out of nowhere. But to find assumptions indirectly, you just start from the given choices, and also it's usually very, very unsubtle because the correct answer, when you reverse it, will destroy the argument completely, and the incorrect answers will either do nothing or they will, in fact, make the argument better. So, okay, but this is the task. So let's do it this way. Let's make them false. I mean, at least let's keep in mind that's the thing that we can do. So that's what we're supposed to do. Now let's talk about adopting a point of view. And notice you might need to read through the words more than once. You might need to browse them and figure out a point of view and then read them more thoroughly. That might be a thing that you have to do. So, in other words, one big mistake, big, fat, huge mistake that I see a lot is people thinking that they should just be able to read these words in a straight line and then be done. Not really how it works. I mean, if you think about reading anything critically in real life, it's vanishingly rare that you can do that. Like, let's say that you're looking at some sort of, like, let's say you're looking at a contract and you want to figure out whether you can take certain days off, then you're probably not just going to read through the vacation pay section in a straight line and be done with it. I mean, you're going to glance at some stuff, you're going to get some ideas, maybe I can do this, maybe I can't do this, then you're probably going to have to look back at certain parts again, and it's going to be like a dialogue between you and the contract. So, same sort of thing here. So my point is, don't expect to just be like, la, 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 read it in a straight line and be done, because it's probably not going to work that way. Probably not. So, anyway, whose point of view are we even really talking about here? This might take a bit of thinking. So, I mean, the conclusion, let's go with let's see, Serge says we should find the conclusion. So the conclusion is this, basically. I mean, that's ultimately the point of this argument, is that, quote, information services present a more balanced picture, unquote. So what in the world does that mean to whom? Yeah, Wilson, because I mean, the point of view, if I say this is the picture that is presented, like whenever you're talking about communicating a message, and this is just sort of common sense, whenever you're talking about communicating a message, the only thing that matters in actual praxis is like the message that the person gets. Like what I mean to say is totally not the point, and what I am trying to say is not really the point either. What matters is what the person gets from it. So when we say information services present a more balanced picture, that means ultimately the consumer of the services, like the person who is watching the television or looking at the internet. That's the hot point here. Like that's what matters. So we should read this from the point of view of the people receiving the information. So you are the viewer or reader or consumer of information. So what they're saying is that they're saying ultimately that if you get information services, it means like the internet. So what they're saying is if you use the internet, you will get a more balanced picture. Like you will not get as unbalanced of a picture. Okay. So let's simplify the argument. This is just a fact. This just says you can get information on the internet now. Great. Okay. That's just background. You can sometimes, on the internet, you don't have to watch the local network news, because the local network news sometimes is biased. And instead, you can get stuff directly from news sources. That's what they're saying on the internet. On the internet, you can get the news directly rather than through intermediaries, middlemen, so to speak. So you will get a more balanced picture. I'll fix the typo. This is what the argument says. You will get a more starts with M, balanced picture. Okay. I mean, we'll talk about the negating the answer choices here in a sec. But can anybody think of an issue with this? I mean, let's think about someone who's actually browsing the internet and who is interested in things like politics. I mean, what this is saying is that you're gonna get a more balanced picture. I mean, do you have any friends who are like super politically active who are also on the internet a lot? Because if you do, you could probably see what the problem is here. We'll present. Okay, so there's the first thing, right? You need to assume that the internet is. So, like, in other words, let's look at this. Let's look at possible issues with this. So when you look at assumptions, you need to try to figure out what would shoot down this argument. So one way to shoot down the reasoning would be what I want to say that's pronounced Beishi. Maybe I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, correct me. Well, okay, cool. That's how it's pronounced. At least as close as I can get without toads. if I tried to do that, that would just not end well. Um, if I tried to shoot down this reasoning, one way I could shoot down this reasoning is like, what if the internet sources are unbalanced? Okay, that's basically what this sheet is saying. Okay. I mean, another thing, at least what comes to mind with me, like I have friends who are very ardent about their political views and who also are on the internet a lot, and like balance with these friends is just, it's not a thing. Like if I have friends who are very, very, very liberal and who spend a lot of time on the internet, they will probably spend all of that time looking at very liberal websites. So in other words, there's also that, right? What if the browsing isn't balanced? What if browsing itself, like selection of sites, okay? Or what if it's easier? Or if it's easier to find more of the same type of sites? So, I mean, that's my first thought. I mean, my first thought is like if you were reading political websites, and even if you were really trying to get a balanced picture, I mean, you know how it is with links that lead to links that lead to other links and so on. I mean, it's very hard to suddenly find a link that leads to the other side of the issue. Like if you're reading a liberal website, you're probably going to see a whole bunch of links to other liberal websites. So there's that. Like, so there could be like, what if the whole internet is unbalanced in the first place? It could also be, what if the form of browsing the internet leads to lack of balance, which is kind of the same thing. Yeah, it's that, right? It's what Mark says. So, and I mean, that thought that Mark is expressing is like a very easy thought to have if you adopt this point of view. Whereas if you're trying to read this as like strict black text facts on a white screen, it's actually really hard to think about that because it's external. So you can see the disadvantage of thinking that way. Okay, so now we have answer choices. So these issues, I mean, the speaker needs to be assuming that the sources themselves are balanced. And then choose one from, so again, that's what we're talking about, right? If you just kind of think about the questions in the chat box, just kind of common sense. If you say that a more balanced picture is presented, I mean, it doesn't matter except on the receiving end, you know? Like if the writers present what they think is a more balanced picture, but then it is distorted by the time it gets to the end user, then no one cares. So the only reasonable way to interpret that statement is on the reader's point of view, because that's the only reasonable place to measure that. You know, like same thing. If I say that, I don't know, if I say like that in a certain country that the food supply that goes out is balanced, I mean, if they send out a balanced food supply, but all of the like protein foods go bad before they get to the consumers, then I guess it's not balanced. Same sort of thing, right? No one cares if if it happens to be balanced when it leaves the factory. That's not the point. The point is when it gets into the hands of the people who are going to consume it. So what if the browsing itself is not balanced? So, well, what if the internet sources are unbalanced? So we have to assume that they are. We have to assume that. Because notice that the argument didn't say this. The argument just said directly rather than through middlemen. So this has nothing to do with balance. And so we just have to assume this. That direct means balance. So that's a very, very dubious connection. Like, what? So that's, yeah, right? And then same sort of thing, we also have to assume that. We also have to assume that the browsing, in other words, we have to assume the presentation is balanced and that the browsing is balanced. We actually assume both these things. So we're assuming that both the presentation and the browsing are balanced. Okay. There. Neato. Okay. Well, if we look for that, accessible enough people as large as percentage of the public. So notice this is not what we're talking about here. Like this, the speaker is not trying to claim that these things are as universally accessible. No, nobody says that here. I mean, they just say that it is more balanced. An analogy, because this was a very popular answer choice, so maybe we need an analogy. Like, this is kind of like saying that, I don't know, some food, like, all right, the lunches at some restaurant or grocery store are more balanced than fast food. It's kind of like, I don't know. Choice A is like saying that as many people can afford those lunches as fast food. That would be nice, but that's not what we're saying. Like, even if very few people can actually afford those, doesn't damage the argument, because the argument is not about widespread consumption. The argument is just about the quality of the product. So this doesn't make any difference. This, there were one or two people who picked it, but we don't want to talk about traditional news sources. We want to talk about the internet. In fact, this whole argument depends on the idea that traditional news sources are not good enough. So anything suggesting that they are goes the wrong way. So B goes the wrong way. Because B suggests that people can do just fine without the internet. That's not the point of the argument. C. There's a lot of words here. You might want to read the core of the sentence, ignoring modifiers or whatever. This says information on the internet does not come almost entirely from groups that share a single bias. In other words, the information is not unbalanced. That's what we need to assume. This is the answer we want. It's not clear that it's probably, this is one of the biggest advantages of doing this negation thing, because the wording of choice C right now is very awkward. At least for me, there's so much negation happening there. There's so much indirectness that it's very hard for me to process that sentence. So, but making it false, this is a very convenient thing to make false. We'll get there in a second. Choice D, traditional news sources are not accurate. That's not the point. The point is nobody is saying that traditional news sources lie or distort. That's not what anybody says here. What people are saying is just that they don't present everything. Like they omit certain points of view. So that's why this is not a thing. It's just not what the argument says. Because remember, assumptions have to be necessary. Like if you randomly added choice D in there, then it might seem to strengthen the argument, but that's not what assumption means. Like assumption means necessary in the current argument. Like the current argument depends on it. So, are you talking about choice C, Canal Garage? If you have issues with that, then one way to attack that is to take another approach, which we'll do in a sec. Because if the sentence itself is a negative, then making that sentence false is usually very easy and convenient. So we'll get that. So let's table that question until we look at negation. Most people who get information from traditional news sources, like E is kind of like B. I mean, again, E is saying that the problem with the traditional sources doesn't even exist really in the first place. Like both E and B are saying that if somebody was getting their news from traditional sources, but was a careful enough thinker, then they would be fine. because the other thing is, because assumptions can't go against what you're saying. I mean, that should be basically common sense. But my point here is that traditional news sources are not good enough. So anything that suggests that traditional news sources are good enough in the hands of capable people is not an assumption, because it goes against what I'm saying. So, C, like cat. Now let's talk about negation. Let's go ahead and make these things false. Let's do that. And then along the way, we'll probably address that question about whatchamacallit, the convoluted sentences or what have you. So here is the question. Choice E is not there for some reason. Let's fix that. All right, there they are. And then let's do this method of negation, because that's what assumption is. Okay. So if you negate A, then basically it's still irrelevant. Like A says, right now A says that the news gets out to as many people as the traditional sources do. So if you make this false, then the internet news doesn't reach as many people. But again, this is still not relevant. This is still not the point at all. Like, this is not an argument about widespread dissemination. This is just an argument about the quality of the product. So, I mean, in fact, even if only 2 people have internet access, this argument is still unaffected by that. So, still irrelevant. Smiley face, if that makes sense, because a lot of people did pick A. If you picked A, then, because this is where personalizing it is going to help you. I mean, if you are the consumer of information in this problem, if you understand what the words are saying, you'll understand that they're telling you, like, the picture that you get is a more complete picture. It doesn't mean that all of your neighbors get the same picture. So you can be the only person with internet access. That's fine. So B, if you make B false, I mean, let's do B and E at the same time. Not a room here, so I'll do it down here. If you make B false, right now it says people can get a thorough understanding if they just go through information from traditional sources carefully enough. So if you make that false, then that means even if people are very careful about it, they cannot get a thorough understanding from traditional news sources. I mean, if this is true, then this definitely helps the argument, because this is a very, very strong point now in favor of, wow, these people need to go on the internet. So that's the worst possible outcome. Remember, when you make these false, you're supposed to destroy the argument. You're not supposed to give additional ammunition to it. So that's bad. Same thing with choice E. If we make E false, then we get people cannot easily identify bias in traditional sources. Again, this helps the argument, because this really just cements the idea that traditional news sources are going to be unavoidably biased. If they could recognize it, they could possibly mitigate it or something, but not if they can't recognize it. Okay, if we make C false, so, and maybe this will answer the question that Kanagaraj asks about convoluted blah, 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 blah. I mean, if does not come almost entirely is false, then you get comes almost entirely. So, you know, if that's not clear, then take a shorter sentence first. Like if I say your clothes are not almost entirely made in China. If that's false, then your clothes are almost all made in China. I mean, again, you're not doing this with rules. You're just doing it with your intuition. Because actually negating statements with rules is really hard to do. It's really, really, really weirdly hard. And you shouldn't do it. You should just kind of common sense think about what it means for something to be false. So if C is false, then you get that the internet news comes almost entirely from one side of the issue, which is what shares a single bias means. Well, this is pretty clearly going to destroy the argument. Because if that's true, then this is definitely not a balanced picture. I mean, notice this is not subtle either. Like, this is one thing that's very cool about assumption problems, is that you will not just weaken an aspect of the argument. Like, when you make the assumption false, the entire argument will be totally destroyed. Like, it will just not work at all anymore. So this is definitely one. Last thing is D. D says that traditional news sources are accurate. Traditional news sources do report accurately. See, here's the point, though, right? Again, that has nothing to do with the problem. The problem is not accuracy. The problem is selectiveness. So this seems like it's a point in favor of the traditional sources, but this does nothing whatsoever to address the actual issue, which is that the reporting is selective, not inaccurate. So, I mean, in other words, that's not what they're saying. They're saying the news only gives you one side. So even if that one side is extremely accurate, that's not going to help anybody. So hopefully, hopefully the deal with the convoluted sentences is addressed here. I mean, if there are too many words in the sentence, then pick out the functional part of the sentence and try to make a simpler example of it. Like if does not come almost entirely is too hard to interpret, then just pull those words out of there and put them into a simpler sentence, and you will probably find that they are easier to deal with. Okay. Other than that, I think that's good for this one. If you have questions, feel free. If not, let's grab another problem. Let's see. Let me find one. How about let's see. How about this one right here? Go for it. You know where to find multiple choice answers. Those are here. Okay, let's try to finish this one up real quick. Don't have something, then pick something. Remember also the question is a bit indirect this time. The question is actually asking you for something that would specifically be a wrong answer if it did not say accept. So All right. So whose point of view, let's think about this for just a sec. Whose point of view is driving this one the most? What we're thinking about is this. We're thinking about how something could have resulted in increased sales. So, I mean, in other words, there's a lot of words in that sentence, because if you're saying agents, then try to think, I mean, if you're saying agents, then do that for a second, and put yourself in the shoes of an agent and think about it. I mean, if you are the agent, are you thinking about what is changing your own behavior, or what are you thinking about? If you're an agent, yeah, if you're an agent, the very first thing you're going to do is think, does this mean that the person will buy insurance from me? So, I mean, so meaning if you think as the agent, you're not like wrong, but it's a stepping stone. It's like a middle step, because ultimately this problem is not about what the agents do or don't do. I mean, you know what they do, and that's not the point. The point is, what are the consumers doing? The point is, like, are the consumers buying additional insurance? So, an increase in sales is a thing, but that's not really a point of view, because sales are not a person or thing that makes a decision. So, but increase in sales means you should translate that into whose choice is that. I mean, increased sales are always the buyer's choice. I mean, the only time that they are ever not is if it's some sort of compulsion, like the state of California makes you buy insurance for your car, or, the communist government makes you buy food from the state store. Unless it's something like that, it's always the choice of the buyer. If you ever talk about sales or not sales, the consumer is the end of that. So ultimately, this means why are the consumers buying more insurance because of this plan? All right, so, and what you're doing is, like, basically the old plan was sell more. The new plan was make the consumer smile. Okay, and so then why are consumers purchasing additional insurance? So you're the consumer, is the point, who is at least thinking about, or at least who is considering buying insurance. So why is this policy, where the policy is to make you smile, helping? Yeah, so, I mean, because notice you'll immediately think of some things. Like what Mark says is that high-pressure sales really sucks for a lot of consumers. It just turns them off. So that would be one very good reason, is that low-pressure sales are just inherently more appealing than high-pressure sales. So absolutely, right? So why is this policy helping? So A means that you, like, your friend actually told you about this insurance agency because they were so happy. So this means that you are now going to consider them, and you would not before. Like, if you're the friend, then you are now a potential consumer, whereas before you weren't. So you are now a new potential client. So this definitely helps. It helps, which means to this answer, it is the wrong answer to this question. B is probably I mean, no one picked B because B is so straightforward, right? I mean, because you listen to them, they were able to, like, sell you more stuff. All right, well, that pretty much tells you directly, right? They sold you more stuff. This says that the agents did not fill out the paperwork Well, that doesn't. This goes the wrong way. It just means that they took longer to fill the paperwork out. So I mean, no matter, I mean, you could spin this so that it would be bad or irrelevant. It just depends. I mean, it probably doesn't really go either way, because the point is the paperwork is done after you make a sale. So this doesn't really seem to have anything to do with more or fewer sales. But that's not the point. The point is you don't need to think that much about it. The point is that it should be dreadfully obvious that this is not a point in favor of more selling. I mean, it just isn't. It's either neutral or bad. I mean, if the sale is done before the paperwork, it's neutral. If the sale doesn't go through until the paperwork is finished, it's bad. So this is definitely not the right direction. Notice, in other words, the point is you don't need to split hairs over whether something, so because it's the wrong answer, that actually makes it the answer we want to this question. I mean, the point is you don't need to split the difference between is it neutral or does it go the other way. Like if the question is does it help, as long as you establish that it clearly does not help, you're good. This one is sort of like A. I mean, this just means new clients. So in this case, it's not friends. In this case, it's people who were pissed off at other agencies. But it doesn't matter. It means the policy brought new clients. Made it rain. And then choice E, lots of words, but the core of the sentence says customers approach the agency to buy more insurance. So new clients and or additional volume of sales. That's good, which means to this question it's the wrong answer. All right, any questions about this? Okay, so let's go back to, you guys didn't have as many issues with this question as you did with the other one. So let's kind of go back to this thing here real quick about, because this whole notion of convoluted sentences, let me go back to that in the chat box. Somebody asked about, where was that? There it is. Okay. So let me just toss out a sort of random suggestion. The first thing that I'm going to claim, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but my experience shows me that I'm probably not wrong about it, which is that this tends to be an issue mostly in assumption questions. And does anybody have any idea why? It's not because they are jerks when they write assumption questions. I mean, if that's what you're thinking, then not really. Because remember, with words, these guys tend to be very, I mean, they do tend to write things as straightforwardly as possible. I mean, that tends to sound surprising to a lot of people because a lot of the words are dense and hard to read, but that's not their fault. There's not really a way to make them easier to read. But does anybody know? Yeah, it's that, right? Because notice that most assumptions do something like this. And so you have, like, by definition, most assumptions are dismissing other ideas. So most assumptions are negative statements at least once. And then if the thing they are shooting down is like a negative qualifier or something like that, then you might get a negation of another negation. You know, like if you know what I mean? Like if you, sort of like that one about in this last problem, like this does not come almost entirely from. I mean, that's chunky, but you can't really simplify that. So, I mean, so here's my suggestion. My suggestion is to just try to And there's going to be a couple of benefits from this. Like, think through your own everyday life, which is probably the ultimate in personalizing arguments, for instances that could be made into these problems. Then make those instances into problems. Like at least with a stimulus and a correct answer. I mean, you don't necessarily have to make incorrect answers, because that's a different skill set. And then just try to internalize how the problems work. And I mean, notice I'm specifically not using the word study, because for the most part, this is not conscious studying. For the most part, you're going to understand perfectly well how this works when you pull examples from your own everyday life. Okay, like for example, here is something. So sometimes, occasionally, Ron goes into fashion outlets during the discount sales and purchases large volumes of women's garments in very large sizes. Therefore, either Ron is purchasing these garments for his friends, for friends who wear large sizes, or else he must be accumulating costumes for theatrical productions. Okay, and the question is, what is the assumption? All right, so notice, here's the deal, right? I actually sometimes do go into fashion outlets and buy large amounts of women's clothing in big sizes. Now, we're going to talk about why that is in a second, but there's a couple of insights. So one of the benefits that you can get is to realize how the arguments are built. Like, this turns out to be not true, which is why this is a critical reasoning question in the first place. But if you think about, where does this come from? Well, so it's not true. You'll see, I mean, we'll explain it in a second. But this is what the cashier probably thinks as they ring up the purchase. So notice that, like, this sort of insight is helpful because it helps you understand, like, where are they getting the statements in these things. So, like, because in an assumption question, you're pretty much thinking about why the conclusion might be wrong, and so you can personalize this as well. Somebody might reasonably think that, but no. Okay, and then the way I would write a correct answer to this question. So yeah, or you could also right? If I were wearing these things or reselling them, that's also that would also be. I mean, that actually turns out not to be the right answer because of what Ron literally does, but that would also be a correct answer if it were there. But here is what actually is the correct answer. Yeah. So, I mean, the truth of the matter is that, and then this would also explain the big sizes really nicely because they have more fabric. So, like, what I'm actually doing with these things is I'm buying them and basically using them as bolts of fabric. So, but the assumption, and notice that the cashier doesn't have to think about this, and in fact, it is pretty much 100% likely that the cashier would never think about this. But that's the point with assumptions, is a lot of assumptions are things that the person is not thinking about at all, and that's what makes them assumptions. So if you negate this, and notice that also if you consider the reselling thing, so let's add the word primarily. into there. So this would allow, so this addresses two things. This makes the sentence more convoluted in general. But also because maybe I'm buying a few of these things for resale. But if you negate this, Ron primarily is buying these things. Ron is buying this stuff primarily to, cut it apart and make other things. So notice that there's like another thing that helps you understand how these problems are built. Because in reality, this is how you make the problem. I mean, the answer choice is actually the negation of the reality. But then how the problem is solved, obviously you're going in the other direction because you have to negate this. And so, and now you understand why the answer choices are so weird looking, because they're not really things. Like they are things that you get by negating things that are actually things. So, and I mean, this is all total common sense if you are using an example from your everyday life. I mean, this is not your life, this is mine. But the point is, I'm sure that if you just think about it, because, I mean, here's the most important part. I would say the most important part of all of this is that right there. Because this is where you learn to make assumption questions in general. Like this is the origin of the question. Is here is a thing, and then people reasonably think that it means one thing, and they are not totally crazy in thinking that, but they are wrong. So in other words, you can learn where these situations come from. Like in the case of assumptions, that's what we learned here. We learned that we have some situation. There's a situation. Someone interprets it in a way that is reasonable, but wrong. And I mean, because I'm sure that you have a ton of situations like this every single day, perhaps even every hour of every day in your life. So like as soon as you make up one of these, you should be able to make up hundreds of them. Because if you can find any situation at all in your life where somebody was reasonable but misinterpreted things, you got an assumption question. And you can make one. And then when you make it, you can solve it, and then you can understand how this works. And then, I mean, my promise to you is that if you do this a few times, and if you put enough effort into it, then when you come back to questions like this, you will suddenly find them a lot easier. Because now you're going to understand basically every side of the creation of the problem. And so, it'll really help the most with stuff like this, because then when there are sentences that are basically weird sentences, now you're going to understand why they are weird sentences, and that will help you process them much more quickly. Because what you should never have, and I mean what you should really not ever have, is like a weird sentence that is inherently weird. Like, I mean, if you have a weird sentence, it should always be related to a non-weird sentence in some straightforward way. Like in the case of assumptions, if the sentence itself is weird, then the negation of the sentence should be not weird. And in other instances too. So that's the point. And like if you ever see questions like this, you shouldn't just be like, well, how do I read weird sentences? Because that's sort of like just sticking a Band-Aid on it. Right? I mean, it might help you, but it's not going to address the real issue. Instead, you should think, obviously not during the time of solving the problem, but when you review and when you do stuff like this, you should think about why are these weird? Because if you can really get to the base of that, then you're going to have some insight that will help you solve all of these. And I mean, before you do that, you also have to absolutely eradicate every thought you might have of these are weird because they are tricking me. Because just remember that does not ever, 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 ever happen. There are no trick questions. There are no trick wordings ever, ever. Just as this is not a trick. I mean, this is the simplest way that I can write this. I cannot write this in any way that is simpler. So if you have that idea in your head, don't. It's the wrong idea. Get it out of your head. And then you'll have better time with these things. So, smiley face in general, if this makes sense. I mean, if I have the job of writing an assumption problem, this is also the whole process behind it. You know, because I have to think of something that would make an assumption problem. So it's like, well, what is a situation that people could misinterpret? There it is. That's how you make these things. So, not genius, but, yeah, it is what it is. All right, let's take a look at another problem. How about, let's see. How about, how about this one? You should see a problem right there on the board. How about this one? And remember, whenever you are talking about that, you know whose point of view is king. Okay. There are two overwhelmingly most popular answer choices here. Those are C and E. We have like two people who are picking other things, but for the most part, it's a contest between C and E. Okay, people who are asking about difficulty level, if you've watched very many of the recordings of these, then you know what my answer is going to be, but the answer is it doesn't matter. It doesn't make any difference. In fact, ironically, just the fact that you are asking this question is proof that the answer cannot possibly help you at all, because if you have to ask it, guess what that means? That means you don't know. And you won't know. Cannot help you. I mean, you can't plan a strategy around things that are unknown and indeterminate. This is important because it's a distraction, and it is a major, major, big, huge distraction. I mean, you really need brain power to solve these things. And if you, like, here's my stupid but effective analogy for this. Let's say that I'm going to shoot a gun at you for 5 minutes and you have to dodge the bullets because you don't want to die. If you are spending any % of your brain power thinking about how difficult was that last bullet to dodge, or about what % of the bullets have landed in this part of the room, you know what? You're probably going to die. if you are not using 100.00000% of your brain for where is the next shot going to hit, let me get out of the way, you're going to die. I mean, this is the same sort of situation. I mean, if you're spending any brain power thinking about difficulty level, oops, you just lost brain power to actually solve the problem with. So don't do it. It's not relevant. It's not big. I mean, every problem is a worthy opponent. You should respect all the problems. It's pretty much the deal. Okay, this problem. So let me make this a little bit concrete. I'm going to choose examples sort of carefully here, but does anybody know this company that I'm going to write here? Does anybody know what that company makes? They make the BlackBerry. Okay. So let's use that as an example. Because I bet most of you didn't know that. I mean, if you're Canadian, you're probably more likely to know that. And if you're in that industry, you're more likely to know that. But random people don't know that. So, and then let's also make this, say, smartphone. Because, I mean, notice, the reason I'm choosing this particular example of all the examples in the world is that choice C is all about people didn't know that this company makes this brand. I mean, that's kind of the point, right? It'll help you think. It'll help you personalize choice C. And I think you know where this is headed, but it will make you realize pretty quickly that choice C is not the right answer because it doesn't matter. But, okay, so smartphones. And I mean, this is the other thing. Like when you review the problem, it's really worth it to think very extensively and carefully about specific examples that will help you understand how this stuff works. So, okay, sales of smartphones have increased. I mean, because they have, right? People are buying smartphones like pancakes. In order to take it, so RIM plans to make more BlackBerries while already advertising them a lot. Because, you know, this is also, a BlackBerry is a good example of both of these things. It is, everybody knows what a BlackBerry is. So, it's already widely, it's not like no one is like, whoa, I've never heard of that, it's so cool. I mean, we all know what BlackBerry is. But not everyone knows the parent company. Okay. So, you are the consumer. You are the consumer, okay? You're looking to buy a smartphone. So we want to know, we want evidence that they're going to make more BlackBerries. And we want evidence that you will just shrug your shoulders and say, eh. And then buy another phone. Okay. That's what we want. Well, we want evidence that you will not care. That this will not push you to go purchase a BlackBerry. Okay. I mean, you might think about reasons why this would. I mean, notice that the only thing they're doing is making more of them. So, what would actually be the only reason why this would lead to additional sales? Like, remember, you're the consumer. If this matters, what's the only possible reason that this could matter? Well, it doesn't say lower prices unless they say that, though. I mean, you can't. you can't assume that additional production will lead to lower prices. Yeah, it's only if the inventory is all out. I mean, additional production leads to lower production costs, but that is not guaranteed to trickle down. I mean, guys, if they make more iPhone 6s, that is definitely not going to lower the price of the iPhone 6. I mean, think about it for a second. That's how commerce works. The only reason this would directly matter to you is if there are not enough of these to go around. Like, that is the only way this could possibly help. So, that. Like, otherwise this will not matter. Like, unless there are not enough of them. Like, unless these keep selling out, this is irrelevant. So therefore, what you should do is you should try to narrow down what the answer is. So there are only two possible ways to answer this question, which are, two possible types of correct answers. The first would be that they directly deny that they are selling out. Like in fact, there is already excess inventory. Which would directly work against this. Otherwise, if it's that, this doesn't matter for any other reason. So otherwise, it would just be like some other thing that shows your consumer, like your consumer lack of consumer interest in general. These are the only two things that could have any bearing on this issue. Because notice that all we are doing is increasing production. Not lowering the price, not changing the quality, not changing the product, in fact, in any way at all. And also advertising is already extensive, so we can't really budge that either. So this is it. And you should also do this with critical reasoning in general. You should try to predict as much as you can what the answer is going to do. As long as you are still open-minded about other possibilities. Like, what I mean by that is, if we go back to my example about buying fabric, where was that? Here. So one person in the chat box mentioned the possibility of like wearing these things or reselling them. That's a good prediction, although it turns out not to actually be what is the truth. So the point is, if you would have all of your mental energy invested in that one possibility, then there might be a danger in making predictions. But if you could predict that, but still be open to possibilities like this, then predicting is either good or neutral, and you should do it. That's really a personal quality. Like, if once you've made a prediction, you are just not open to other possibilities, if that's a personal trait that you have, then you should realize that making predictions will be dangerous. On the other hand, if you tend to still be flexible after having made a prediction, then not dangerous. That's not really binary. Most people are somewhere in the middle of that. But you should know where you stand, because that's going to be an important personal angle of it. So, okay. Blackberries. A says their share of all smartphone sales has gone down. That's fine. That doesn't tell us anything. That maybe just means that the other smartphone manufacturers are doing even better, but this doesn't help shed any light on the issue. What is this? Inventory awaiting shipment has declined. What does that mean? Awaiting shipment to retailers. This means they're doing what faster than they're doing what? Yeah, this means that they're shipping them faster than they're making them. So this is a wrong way answer. I mean, this actually points. It's not as dramatic as they keep selling out, but that's where it is headed, right? Like this would mean they're shipping out. They're shipping them out faster than they're making them. So this would actually go to show that it would be a very good idea to make more of these things. Okay, now C is the reason why I chose the particular example of RIM, which is a company that very few people have heard of, and the BlackBerry, which is a brand that everybody has heard of. She is saying that everybody knows what a BlackBerry is, but relatively few people know that it is made by a company called RIM. And you know what? Absolutely nobody cares. There's no reason to think you would care about those. So not relevant. Because the name of the parent company, why would we even care about that? I mean, notice, see, if you're like layering random assumptions on top of this, then you can get in trouble. Like if I chose, like, I mean, I don't think Apple really has subsidiaries, but like if Apple owned some company that made a product, and if people didn't know that was made by Apple, then that might matter, because like a lot of people are like, oh, if Apple makes anything, it is the best thing ever made. But see, the thing is, that's why I chose RIM as an example, because this is a company with which nobody has a knee-jerk reflex of like, yay, or oh no. I mean, it's just kind of random and no one really has an opinion about it. So, and the problem doesn't tell you that Mammoth is any sort of name that has a good or bad knee-jerk reaction from the public. I mean, if you were told that people have the utmost trust in this company called Mammoth, in the same way that lots and lots of people have the utmost trust in Apple, then this would be the right answer to the question. Because then this would mean, oh, hey, if you tell them that Apple makes this product, they will totally buy it. But not Mammoth. Mammoth, what's that? What's RIM? No one cares. Or at least there's no reason to assume that people would have any particular reaction of trust or not trust. So smiley face, if this makes sense. And especially if you picked C, and if this is really obvious to you now that I've chosen RIM and BlackBerry, then that's what you have to do when you study these problems. You have to just sit there with them and try to think of a real life analogy for it. And if not, walk away from it for a day or two and then walk back. Also, try to put blanks, right? Like, don't just try to think of the analogy straight unless you can come up with it quickly. Like, put a blank where it used to say Mammoth. Then come back to it in a week and try to fill in the blank with something. You know, then that might make it easier. So, okay. Choice D is, well, that's nice, but there's no reason to care. I mean, looking at percentages of, like, A and D are bad for the same reason. I mean, we don't really care about market share. We just care about whether we can sell more phones than we currently sell. So that has nothing to do with what is the current market share. Doesn't make any difference. Okay, and then lastly we have E. I mean, E says that even though they've gotten cheaper, people are buying fewer of them. I mean, that's definitely a general indicator of lack of interest. So that's what we want. It's the only choice that even goes in that direction. I mean, notice that, I mean, you could probably argue that this choice is not absolutely 100% perfect in the sense that it doesn't guarantee things. But that's not the point of these problems. The point of these problems is that they will have 4 answers that are completely wrong and then 1 answer that is right. Like if you think about this question, if you're the consumer, you have irrelevant, wrong way, irrelevant, correct answer. It's always white, 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 black. There should not be any gray. I mean, worst case scenario, it's going to be white, 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 and like very dark gray. And then you pick the choice that is very dark gray. That's how it works. So, you know, and this is definitely an instance where it is white and white and white and white, and so it doesn't matter. If you think this is black, if you think it's very dark gray, you still pick it. And that's how these problems work. So the other object lesson there is that if you if you think it's confused between two choices, like if you were down to C and E here, it's much more of an issue of cleanly eliminating C. Because the wrong answers are going to be completely 100% wrong. Like they're not going to be like a little bit less correct. You know, you could probably argue that E is dark gray instead of black, but there's no arguing that C is anything but white. And that's my point. So, all right, Nito, well, it's overtime. Okay, I gotta run here, guys. But some valuable lessons there. Notice, if I had to really summarize the generalities that I made today, I could summarize them by saying that you need to be really an active participant here. You know, like I'm talking about making problems from your real life, and I'm talking about making analogies. I mean, the CR is not the kind of thing that you can just study examples made by other people and get very far by doing that. That's not really a thing. It can be dangerous if your prediction assumption closes your mind off to the actual right answer, right? Like in the problem about buying the used clothes or buying the discount clothes. Like if you are looking only for the idea of resale or wearing them, then if that's going to make you see the fabric thing and be like, oh, irrelevant, not what I predicted, then that's bad. So in other words, if you think, because like the point is that there's a lot of different ways to do this. So if you come up with X, which could be right, but then I give you Y, which also could be right, the deal is that if X makes you less likely to realize that Y is right, then X is a bad thing to do. But if you can predict X and still realize that Y also helps, then fine, is the deal. Okay. Let's quit. I seriously have to jump here, guys, but thank you. And next one of these is in 2 weeks. After that, there's a little bit of a hiccup in the schedule. I think there's a 3-week break before the following one. It's on, the next one's in 2 weeks, and the one after that is on, I want to say, September like 10th or something, because I'm doing some traveling on the Thursday. That is 2 weeks, but it'll be posted. The next one's in 2 weeks, and then we will go from there. The right answer here is E, like elephant. Okay, because E, like elephant, is some other thing that shows lack of interest in general. All right.